Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to continue our study of changes in American society during the Gilded Age by looking at quote-unquote new nativism and the rise of a changing American culture. As you hopefully remember, one of the things that is sort of a central theme within human society is the establishment of us versus the other, and how in American society we've decided that certain groups of immigrants are too foreign or too different to ever truly be integrated into American society. So during the Gilded Age, we get lots of new and scary groups showing up who are going to be too different to ever be incorporated into American society, as well as a slow acceptance of some of the other groups that used to be other and are now starting to become part of who we are. So that's going to be an exciting process. So we'll talk about push and pull factors, we'll talk about responses of Americans, and then we'll look at the transformation of American life, of American culture, American art, American media, stuff like that. So as we hopefully know, immigration comes in waves due to a variety of different push and pull factors. Pull factors are, of course, the things that pull immigrants into specific parts of the world, whereas push factors are factors pushing them out of various places. During this time period, we are now in this large hump here, where we're starting to see immigrants showing up from a variety of slightly different places. Obviously, still a lot of Northern and Western Europeans. The pull factors for American society at this point is generally as the economic opportunity associated with the second industrial revolution and massive expansion westward. The push factors are unrest in Europe and Asia, places like that. We, of course, have the wars of German unification, the Franco-Prussian War. We've got nationalism in the Ottoman Empire, the Russo-Turkish War, and displacement specifically of Jewish and other ethnic minorities in Russia associated with Russification and the attempt to create a standard Russian society. And so all of that are pushing people out of various places. And the main place that's accepting or that's allowing lots of immigrants in at this point is the United States, mostly because of the demand for cheap industrial labor. So we're starting to see the sources of these immigrants change, which creates problems for us. Rather than have it be predominantly Germans, Irish, Scottish, English people, things like that, we're now seeing huge amounts of Austro-Hungarians come over in the aftermath of the Hungarian Revolt. We're starting to see Italians come over in the aftermath of the wars for Italian unification. We're starting to see people coming in from Russia during this time period, again, because of Russification. And we're starting to see large waves of Scandinavians come in as crop failures and other problems push people out of Norway and Sweden. At the same time, we're also seeing Japanese people migrating in as the Meiji Restoration is in progress. And so Japanese society has become more open. And we're seeing continued immigration from China as the Qing dynasty attempts to reform itself and to some degree continues its long collapse until it's finally destroyed in the early 20th century. All of this leads to the rise of new nativism. Nativism is, of course, this idea that us Native Americans need to be protected against these foreigners who can, of course, never truly be assimilated into American society because their cultures, their language, their religions, their customs are really just too different, and they're not compatible with our type of Anglo-Saxon democracy. Of course, the hypocrisy of the whole thing is we've had this reaction to more or less every group of immigrants showing up. And the same people who are now saying, oh, American society is closed to you and there's no possible way to assimilate you in, at one point, their ancestors also immigrated in and generally faced similar types of discrimination. And so generally, as new groups are assimilated in, they often become the most stringent anti-immigrant, as now they're on the side of saying, we're real Americans, and all of you people out there, it helps to solidify their role as Americans to be opposed to other groups becoming American. And so some irony and hypocrisy there, of course. Here we see an anti-immigration cartoon about how all of these new Jewish refugees who have been forced out of Russia are, they're not Christian, and so they have a different Sabbath that they celebrate. They're poor because all of their stuff was destroyed in pogroms. They hold diseases because they've been traveling around and interacting with various people. And they might be associated with violent anarchy because, violent anarchy is a thing that's on the rise. And so how do we know that they're not a terrorist trying to destroy America? Well, we should probably just keep them all out just to be safe. Although there's a lot of anti-immigrant propaganda, specifically anti-Italian, anti-Catholic propaganda, Generally, there's not a lot of action taken from this. We do get different hate groups like the Klan, who's going to add immigrants and Catholics to the groups of people that they hate. And we do get anti-immigrant newspapers advocating things like, dumping Italians into the sea because of their, degenerate criminality. But we're not going to see any major restrictions on immigrants for the most part during the Gilded Age. And immigrants, for the most part, are going to be able to be settled into enclave communities within urban areas, partially due to the support of political machines. These immigrants are then going to create their own sort of social structures, their own social organizations to help preserve some elements of their original and traditional culture, language, customs, and to some degree keep their culture alive. Although the constant pressure between trying to adhere to and keep alive your own traditional ethnic identity versus assimilating into American culture is a tension that all immigrants are going to constantly have to deal with. For many immigrants, they found it easier to assimilate, to take some elements of their traditional culture and make them more American, to do similar things to what they had always done, but to Americanize them in order to make themselves appear more sort of American and regular. In my own family's background, my grandmother spoke Norwegian at home, but refused to teach her children Norwegian, refused to teach my father and his brothers Norwegian, because she was very embarrassed about how she was teased about her Norwegian accent as a child. So she struggled most of her young life to get rid of her thick Norwegian accent, and then refused to allow her kids to learn the language in order to allow them to assimilate more completely. We also see some real tensions here between new immigrants and greenhorns. So take a moment and pause and read the letters to the Jewish Daily Forward, which are just utterly fantastic evidence that young people have always been young people. Immigrants often provided the surplus labor that was absolutely necessary to take on a lot of the projects that we talked about throughout the Gilded Age. The mining, the creation of subways, the creation of elevated trains, the creation of large suspension bridges. All of this is done mostly through immigrant labor. In order to keep costs down, immigrants were generally the cheapest source of labor that people could hire. And because many of the tasks have been overly simplified due to Taylorism, it was very easy to plug in recent immigrants and make them a productive part of the manufacturing team. And so many of the massive sort of undertakings that make American society modern and, sort of the envy of the world during the Gilded Age are at least partially responsible or partially made possible by the arrival of cheap immigrant labor. But this also creates tension with American workers who feel like all this excess labor is continually depressing wages. And many labor organizations would attempt to exclude immigrants because they, again, worried that they were, by increasing the supply of labor, depressing wages and hurting American workers. Immigrants generally settled in tenement houses. These were cheaply constructed sort of high-rise buildings that would house, were supposed to house one family, but would often house multiple families. The dumbbell tenement became sort of the standard dwelling within urban areas, and these would go up, 10, 15 stories, with each story having about 4 units here. You can see there's also a public bathroom here in the middle. But every family has some element of privacy with bedrooms, a living room, a parlor, and a fire escape. And so although these were relatively cramped and unpleasant, they did provide some opportunities for immigrants. You could sort of see what they would look like on the inside here and see what rows of dumbbell tenements connected together would look like in an urban setting. You could see the elevated train going through in the front, demonstrating, again, the importance of mass transit in connecting residential to industrial areas. And so through the construction of these buildings, immigrants were able to be assimilated into American society relatively effectively. This did create some massive problems with sanitation as people were moving into such close quarters. So we started to see outbreaks of diseases like cholera, typhus, things like that, dysentery, from polluted water or food. And so political machines and to some degree industrialists funded and provided money for the creation of new infrastructure, most famously large sewer systems. So this is the creation of the sewer system in New York City. These sewer systems would allow waste and water to flow under the streets as opposed to through them, separating people out from these diseases and separating people out from bacteria and allowing for greater public health. And so we came up with scientific solutions to these problems. And then, of course, immigrants often provided the labor for the creation of these sewer systems, allowing for cleaner, more healthy cities in general. As far as passing laws to sort of restrict immigrants, there were some pushes to do this. There were some physical exams and things like that people pushed, and some ideas of sort of social Darwinism that should be used to weed out undesirable immigrants. But it's really not until the 1920s that we start getting sort of the immigrant processing system that we're familiar with Ellis Island and Angel Island being sort of the immigrant processing centers. At this point, it's mostly if you can get to the United States, you will be allowed in. There's really no restrictions or laws preventing immigrants from coming to the United States, despite the fact that the Immigration Restriction League attempted to make racial distinctions between immigrants. None of this was actually codified in law. And we sort of already talked about social Darwinism in the context of businesses. We also start to see this applied as a pseudoscience to races of people, with the idea that, well, clearly because European people have the greatest sort of economic and technological development at this point in history, that must mean it's because of their inherent fitness and not a series of, sort of conditional things that happened in the Industrial Revolution to push Europeans above other groups of people, who had previously been sort of the economic center of the world. So social Darwinism becomes the justification for acts like Chinese exclusion, because the one exception to this is Chinese exclusion laws were passed, mostly due to pressure from people on the West Coast. We end up passing a law in 1882 under Chester A. Arthur that excludes Chinese people. That is then extended out, and Chinese exclusion becomes the law of the land, with only a few exceptions. There were exceptions put in for Chinese people to come in and open up businesses that white people in those areas did not want to do. And so Chinese people were allowed to open up things like laundromats, restaurants, some of those, and then were allowed to bring over relatives and other people to work in those establishments. And so those were ways to get around the Chinese Exclusion Act. But in general, most Chinese people were excluded, despite the fact that all of the rest of the immigration laws were wide open during this time period. We also, as we talked about before, see the rise of leisure activities. We see, the rise of bicycles that people can use to get around. People go to horse races. We see the beginning of these World's Fairs, these Columbian expeditions in places like Chicago and Buffalo, where people from all over the world come in to see, new technological developments, new scientific developments. Sort of the World's Fair specifically in Chicago was really the Americans' sort of coming out party to the world, as far as, demonstrating that they were truly a nation that was on par with any European nation. As economically, they're now producing more of the world's manufactured products, and they've really become the center of innovation and technology, with new bridge techniques, with electricity, with a lot of these other sort of inventions, sort of leading the way for pushing human society and technology forward. We also see the rise of organized sporting events during this time period. For example, the quintessential American sport of baseball has now become very popular. It really gained popularity during the Civil War as a way for soldiers to entertain themselves when they weren't fighting, because a lot of soldiering is marching and waiting. And so baseball games became a way for different companies of soldiers to compete against each other and stave off the boredom. We also see the rise of American football, especially collegiate football, as a popular sport within the United States. And both of these become important spectator sports during this time, as Taylorism sort of simplifies the American workflow, provides for more leisure time and more money. And as we get this rising middle class, we get different sort of outlets for this middle class to spend their time and money on. And so sports becomes one of those main sort of pastimes. Here's a quick text about how Teddy Roosevelt saved the game of football and how we modernized the rules of American football. So take a moment, pause, and read this. And this is a article about how baseball's rules changed and standardized over time. I think I agree with the author that some of the other versions, the Massachusetts version, was probably superior to the New York version, but in the end, we went with the New York version, and it's fine. Baseball's fine. We get the rise of amusement parks during this time period. Coney Island outside of New York City becomes one of the first amusement parks with rides and shops and games and things like that to provide leisure activities for people. We get the beginning of the first roller coasters, specifically the Switchback Railway, which would take people up and down this rail track, which was utterly transformative, especially for sort of urban dwellers who had never experienced anything like this before. Here's the history of the roller coaster. So take a moment, pause, and read, and then we'll move on. And we also get the rise of Romanticism. This had somewhat come out of the Second Great Awakening, and some of it is part of the whole post-Napoleonic era. But in the United States, we saw the Hudson River School focusing on a romanticization of the American West. As we start using more land in the West and Americans feel more disconnected from nature, this is a movement to try to create these sort of artistic models or these sort of artistic visions to reconnect us with nature and spur sort of an emotional connection within the audience. We also see Winslow Homer doing his American Romanticism, sort of idealizing American life, rugged individualism, sort of this traditional rural vision of America that has been fading away. So we see Winslow Homer doing these. And we see American realism with Howells and James and Mark Twain trying to capture sort of the oeuvre of American life. Howells focused on, sort of these changes as far as newly wealthy people trying to navigate society. Henry James focused on Americans taking their place on the world stage and how their customs differed from Europeans. And Mark Twain tried to capture both sort of an idealized American past, but also pointed political critiques of American society. In his book, The Gilded Age, he strongly criticized sort of the culture of largesse, wealth, and monopoly that had taken over American society. The same from An American Yankee in King Arthur's Court. And when you look at books like Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, you see critiques of American society, critiques of racism, things like that. And so Mark Twain became one of the strongest critics of this period in history. We also saw the rise of American nationalism, with nationalists like John James Audubon trying to paint and categorize bird species and other sort of natural organizations, with the Audubon Society eventually being a naturalist organization trying to preserve a lot of these wild spaces. So that brings us to the end of nativism and the development of American culture. For next time, we'll wrap up with the growth of the populists, which is going to start leading us into the collapse of the fourth party system and bring in new political parties and issues. So we'll talk about that next time. But for now, thank you for listening.